Welcome to Fluent Daily, the English listening channel for advanced learners at B2 and C1 level. Every episode features a rich, flowing conversation in natural English on a topic that is genuinely worth thinking about: history, psychology, science, philosophy, and more. There are no simplified sentences here, no slow speech, no vocabulary drills. Just real English spoken naturally on ideas that matter. This is Fluent Daily. Let's get into it.
Today we have a great story, so let's get started right now.
If you turn on the news tonight, it basically feels like the world is on fire.
Oh, absolutely. It's everywhere.
Right. You see these images of brutal wars, violent crime, political unrest, and just systemic cruelty. And it's broadcast directly into your living room or, onto your phone in high definition 24 hours a day. It is completely overwhelming.
It creates this really heavy, sinking feeling like humanity is just spiraling out of control.
Exactly. But what if I told you that statistically, right now, as you listen to this deep dive, you are actually living in the safest, most peaceful era in the history of the human species?
It sounds completely counterintuitive. For a lot of people, it almost sounds offensive to even suggest it, given the very real suffering that exists in the world today.
It does. It feels a bit like gaslighting, honestly. But today, we are exploring one of the most hotly debated questions about human history. Is the world actually getting safer, or are we just as violent as we've always been? So, okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
We are diving deep into the empirical data, the archaeological records, centuries of homicide statistics, and the intense scholarly warfare that has erupted around this whole declining violence theory. We want to see where humanity truly stands today.
And setting the stage for this deep dive requires a very specific kind of intellectual discipline. We cannot start from a position of blind utopian optimism.
Right, like everything is perfect.
Exactly. Nor can we start from a position of cynical doom-mongering. Both of those extremes act like a filter that just distorts the data. If you really want to understand the true trajectory of the human condition, you have to look directly at the raw numbers, understand the highly complex ways those numbers were gathered, and honestly, acknowledge where the genuine uncertainties lie.
Which is exactly what our mission is here. So to understand why this debate is so intense, we have to go back to 2011. That was the epicenter of this intellectual earthquake.
Oh yeah, that was a huge year for this topic.
Because that year, the cognitive psychologist Steven Pinker published this massive 700-page brick of a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature.
It is quite the read.
Yeah, it's a doorstopper. And his central thesis was staggering in its scope. He didn't just argue that, one specific type of war was down. He argued that violence in virtually every conceivable form, from personal assaults in the street to global interstate wars to systemic genocide and even cruelty to animals, has declined dramatically over the long sweep of human history.
And that breadth is exactly what made the thesis so provocative. He was attempting to synthesize psychology, history, sociology, and economics into this single unified theory of human progress.
Which is incredibly ambitious.
It is. And crucially, he argued that this decline wasn't just a statistical fluke or a temporary lull in the fighting. He posited that it represents genuine, structural, moral progress. Humanity, in his view, has fundamentally changed the way it organizes itself to suppress our violent impulses.
And man, the reaction to this thesis was like a bomb going off in the academic community. The split was just immediate and incredibly loud.
Oh, the reviews were wild.
Right. You had these enthusiastic, glowing endorsements, mostly coming from quantitative historians, economists, and other psychologists. They looked at the mountain of empirical data. He assembled these long-term trend lines, plotting deaths over centuries, and they found the case airtight.
But then you had this furious, almost visceral rejection from other scholars.
Yeah, they were not having it.
Not at all. They attacked his methodology, his framing of history, and the ideological subtext of his argument. What's fascinating here is how strongly the broader cultural climate dictated the reception of this thesis.
What do you mean by that?
Well, think about the cultural backdrop of the early 2010s and beyond. We were seeing the rise of hyperpolarized political discourse, the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, and an accelerating algorithm-driven news cycle optimized to show us threat and conflict.
Basically a machine built to make us anxious.
Exactly. When a culture is constantly marinated in a sense of crisis, an argument that claims things have never been better clashes violently with our daily psychological experience.
It's the ultimate disconnect between the macro and the micro. I mean, if I'm standing outside in a torrential downpour, soaking wet, and a meteorologist walks up with a beautifully printed chart proving that average global rainfall is actually down 2% this decade, I'm still standing in the rain.
Right, you don't care about the chart.
I don't care about the chart at all. My immediate lived experience makes me want to rip that chart up.
That is a perfect illustration of the psychological barrier at play here. And what a careful analysis of the debate reveals is how heavily confirmation bias drove both sides. People who were deeply invested in the triumph of Western liberal democracy, the Enlightenment, and market capitalism embraced the thesis immediately.
Because it validated their worldview.
Exactly. It proved them right. Conversely, those whose life's work focused on modern systemic injustices, inequality, or post-colonial critique rejected it instantly because it seemed to minimize the very real, ongoing struggles they were documenting. The actual evidence often took a backseat to the ideological battle.
Which means if we want to know the truth, we have to bypass the ideology and go straight to the foundational data. If we're going to determine whether violence has actually declined, we need a baseline. We have to rewind the clock all the way back.
All the way to prehistory.
Right. How violent were humans before police forces, written laws, or centralized governments even existed? Let's look at the prehistoric reality.
Well, when you strip away written history, the most direct evidence we have about human behavior comes from paleopathology.
Which is basically looking at ancient diseases and injuries, right?
Right. Specifically skeletal remains in this context. Anthropologists excavate these ancient burial sites and meticulously examine the bones for clear, undeniable evidence of violent death.
So they're looking for, what, sword marks?
Well, more like crushed skulls, defensive fractures on the forearms, or projectiles like stone arrowheads physically embedded in the bone. They then combine this archaeological data with ethnographic records, which are detailed observations of contemporary or recent small-scale hunter-gatherer societies that operate without a centralized state.
And compiling that data totally shatters a deeply ingrained cultural narrative. Because for centuries, we've had this popular idea, the Rousseauian myth of the peaceful primitive.
Named after the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Yeah, it's this romanticized notion that early humans lived in a state of harmonious nature, cooperating perfectly, and that it was only the invention of modern civilization, cities, and property that corrupted us and made us violent. But the actual stones and bones tell a much darker, much more brutal story.
They really do. The turning point in the academic consensus largely stems from Lawrence Keeley's 1996 work, War Before Civilization. Keeley is an archaeologist who grew incredibly frustrated with his field's tendency to politely ignore or gloss over evidence of ancient violence.
Like they would find a crushed skull and say, oh, he probably fell off a cliff.
Exactly. But Keeley documented widespread, lethal, organized violence in prehistoric and pre-state societies, and his data was an absolute shock to the system.
Just how violent are we talking about here?
Incredibly violent. Keeley found that in many pre-state societies, a staggering proportion of the population died at the hands of other humans. In certain archaeological sites, like the Crow Creek Massacre site in South Dakota, which dates back to the 1300s, or ancient sites in Europe, the rates of violent death could exceed 10 to 15% of the total population.
Let me just pause on that number for a second, because 15% is really hard to conceptualize. If you apply 15% violent mortality rate to the population of the modern United States, that would be roughly 50 million people being murdered or killed in combat.
It's an apocalyptic level of continuous violence.
It's unimaginable. And this wasn't just Keeley finding one anomalous mass grave. Another researcher, the economist and behavioral scientist Samuel Bowles, did a sweeping analysis of both archaeological sites and ethnographic data on ancestral hunter-gatherers. His estimate landed right around the same terrifying mark. Approximately 14% of deaths in these ancestral societies were caused by warfare and interpersonal violence.
But, and this is important, we have to introduce a vital nuance here. Drawing from the work of anthropologists like Raymond Kelly in his book Warless Societies and the Origin of War, Kelly cautions against replacing the myth of the peaceful primitive with the new myth of the universally bloodthirsty savage.
Okay, so it wasn't just a constant free-for-all everywhere.
No. He points out that not all pre-state societies were constantly at war. The presence and intensity of violence were highly variable, and they depended heavily on local ecology.
So the environment basically dictated the aggression.
Precisely. If a small band of hunter-gatherers lives in a harsh, unforgiving environment where food and water are scarce, the incentive to violently raid neighboring groups for survival is incredibly high. It becomes a zero-sum game for survival.
It's either us or them.
Right. However, if a group lives in a lush, resource-abundant environment, perhaps isolated by natural geographic boundaries like mountains or dense jungle, the rate of interpersonal violence might be significantly lower. The capacity for extreme violence is universally human, but the expression of it is triggered by environmental and social conditions.
I get that, but I have to put on the skeptic's hat here for a moment. If our entire baseline for human history relies on examining surviving bone fragments from 10,000 years ago and then making comparisons to a handful of modern hunter-gatherer groups, isn't there a colossal risk of getting the math wrong?
Oh, there's a huge risk.
Right. I mean, how do we know we aren't just unearthing the ancient equivalent of the battlefield of Gettysburg, finding a concentrated pile of violent deaths, and wrongly assuming that every Tuesday in the Pleistocene era was a bloodbath?
That is exactly the pushback that anthropologists and statisticians raise, and it is entirely valid. The methodological challenges in establishing this prehistoric baseline are immense. First, as you noted, the sample size. The skeletal remains we have recovered represent a microscopic fraction of all humans who lived during prehistory. They are not a perfectly randomized sample.
We're looking at a tiny fraction of a fraction.
Exactly. Second, paleopathology has a massive detection problem. If a prehistoric hunter is clubbed over the head, it leaves a mark on the skull. But if someone is fatally stabbed in the gut or has their throat cut, the soft tissue decays, and the bones tell us absolutely nothing about the violent nature of their death, so the violence we can actually see is likely a severe undercount.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about that. And what about using modern hunter-gatherers as a proxy for ancient humans?
That is the third major challenge. Extrapolating the behavior of ancestral populations from contemporary hunter-gatherer societies requires a massive leap of faith. The small-scale societies observed in the 19th and 20th centuries had already been deeply marginalized. They had been pushed into the harshest, least desirable environments by expanding modern states.
So they were already under extreme stress.
Yes. Their behavior under those extreme pressures might not accurately reflect how humans behaved globally 10,000 years ago when they had the run of the entire planet.
So we are dealing with an incomplete puzzle where half the pieces are missing and the picture on the box is blurred. Yet despite those flaws, the broad academic consensus still points in a specific direction. Even when you adjust for the sampling errors and the detection biases, the overarching reality remains. The baseline of human prehistory was marked by a frequency of lethal violence that absolutely dwarfs what we experience in modern state societies.
That's the key takeaway.
Right. Whether the true average was 14% or 8% or 10%, it is light years away from the statistical realities of the modern developed world.
Correct. The absolute scale of the violence was profound. The question then becomes, if that was our starting point, what on earth changed? How did we engineer a society where the vast majority of people will live their entire lives without ever once swinging a weapon at another human being in anger?
To figure out how we transitioned away from that, we have to fast forward out of the mud and the bone fragments and step into the era of written records. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because we can look at the most meticulously kept long-term data on homicide in the world, which comes from Western Europe.
Right. The transition from prehistory to medieval Europe provides us with something incredibly valuable paperwork.
Bureaucracy saves the day.
It really does. We have court records, coroner's inquests, and detailed burial registers that, in some regions, extend all the way back to the 13th century. Sociologist Manuel Eisner at the University of Cambridge spent years assembling what is widely considered the most comprehensive historical database of homicide estimates for Western Europe. He painstakingly tracked the changing rates of murder over hundreds of years.
And Eisner's data is jaw-dropping. If you look at records from 13th and 14th century England, places like London or Oxford, the estimates show roughly 20 to 50 homicides per 100,000 people every single year. For context, in contemporary England, the homicide rate hovers around 1 per 100,000.
Let the magnitude of that drop sink in. You were looking at a society that was 20 to 50 times more likely to murder each other over interpersonal disputes, tavern brawls, or property disagreements.
That's just staggering.
And the data shows this wasn't a sudden drop. It was a jagged but remarkably consistent downward slope spanning several centuries. Across England, Germany, Switzerland, and Italy, the European historical record clearly documents a massive plunge in interpersonal violence.
Which forces the obvious question, why? Did humans suddenly evolve a different brain structure in the Middle Ages? That doesn't make any sense. So what social technology was invented to stop us from killing each other over a spilled pint of ale? To answer that, the data points us toward a foundational concept in sociology proposed by Norbert Elias in 1939, known as the civilizing process.
Elias's thesis is brilliant in its observation of human psychology. He argued that this long-term decline in European murder rates wasn't about biology. It was about the fundamental transformation of habits, emotions, and self-regulation. He observed that as medieval Europe transitioned into the early modern period, centralized state power began to consolidate. You saw the emergence of what he called court society.
Meaning the chaotic patchwork of local warlords and feudal barons was replaced by powerful kings with massive administrative reaches.
Precisely. And as these states consolidated, they claimed something very specific to model on the legitimate use of violence. The king, the state, established courts, police forces, and standing armies. Suddenly, the state was the ultimate arbiter of justice.
So if someone stole your cow, you could no longer ride over with your brothers and burn their house down.
Because if you did, the king's men would hang you.
Right. The state essentially outsourced revenge.
Yes. And because the state monopolized the use of force, the entire social fabric had to transform. The aristocracy, who previously gained status through martial prowess and brute strength, now had to gain status by gaining the king's favor at court. You had to learn diplomacy, etiquette, and emotional control.
So you had to be polite.
Exactly. Elias tracked how manuals of manners became incredibly popular during this time. People were literally being taught to internalize self-restraint. They learned to control their impulses, to foresee the long-term consequences of their actions, and to view spontaneous physical violence as uncouth and socially ruinous.
It's fascinating. You essentially have a society undergoing a mandatory multi-generational anger management course, enforced by the looming threat of the king's dungeon. And Pinker took Elias's foundational thesis and layered several more mechanisms on top of it to explain how this civilizing process accelerated. He points to the Enlightenment, which sparked an intellectual shift toward valuing human life, reason, and humanism over religious dogmatism. He also points heavily to the massive expansion of literacy.
Literacy is a profound driver of empathy. The introduction of the printing press meant people weren't just reading agricultural ledgers, they were reading novels. Epistolary novels, written from the first-person perspective, forced readers to inhabit the minds of people who were completely different from them, different genders, different social classes, different nationalities.
It puts you right in their shoes.
That practice of perspective-taking physically rewires how you view an outgroup.
And then there's the economic gear in the machine commerce. Pinker argues that commerce is one of the most powerful pacifying forces ever invented. Think about it from the perspective of a medieval farmer. Historically, the neighboring village over the hill is nothing but a physical threat. If a drought hits and food is scarce, they might come over the hill and slaughter you for your grain. Therefore, your logical incentive is to launch a preemptive strike and eliminate them first.
It's a classic security dilemma.
Exactly. But once you introduce a complex system of trade and currency, the dynamic flips entirely. That village over the hill is no longer a physical threat to be eliminated. They are your primary customer base. You have surplus grain and they have surplus wool. Suddenly, their prosperity is vital to your survival.
Because a dead customer can't pay you.
Right. You actually need them to be alive, secure, and wealthy enough to buy your goods.
That is the transition from a zero-sum game where their survival comes at the cost of yours to a positive-sum game where mutual cooperation creates wealth for both parties. It fundamentally alters the calculus of human interaction. War becomes economically disastrous.
This all sounds incredibly cohesive. The civilizing process, the printing press, mutually beneficial trade networks. It forms a neat, logical narrative of continuous human improvement. Until we run headfirst into a towering historical brick wall that threatens to demolish the entire theory. The 20th century. I mean, how can anyone look at the 1900s and confidently declare that violence is in decline?
You have hit on the single most intense point of friction in this entire debate. The 20th century presents a staggering empirical paradox. This is the century that unleashed mechanized industrial-scale slaughter. We saw 2 global world wars. We saw the horrors of the Holocaust, the systematic starvation and executions of the Soviet Gulag, the devastating famines of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, the killing fields of Cambodia, and the Rwandan genocide.
It's just a litany of horrors.
It is. When you look purely at the raw, absolute number of human beings killed by organized political violence, the 20th century is unparalleled in the historical record.
The sheer volume of blood spilled is unfathomable. So if the thesis is that violence has been steadily declining, how does Steven Pinker or anyone else defend that claim against the reality of the 20th century?
The defense rests entirely on a mathematical framework, the crucial distinction between absolute numbers, and relative per capita rates. Pinker freely acknowledges that the absolute death toll of the 20th century is the highest in history. However, he points out that the global human population in the 20th century was also the largest in history by an exponential margin.
So there were just way more people to kill.
Basically, yes. His mathematical argument is that to accurately compare the violently destructive nature of different historical eras, you cannot look at raw body counts. You have to express those deaths as a proportion of the global population alive at the time.
So he is arguing that even though the pile of bodies was larger, the actual percentage of the human race that died violently was smaller than in previous eras.
Precisely. When Pinker normalizes the data per capita, the 20th century shifts down the rankings. He points to devastating historical events like the Bronze Age collapse, the Mongol conquests of the 13th century, or the Anlushan Rebellion in 8th century China. During the Anlushan Rebellion, for instance, tens of millions of people died in a world whose total population was only a few hundred million.
Wow.
Pinker calculates that as a percentage of the global population, the carnage wrought by the Mongols or the ancient Chinese civil wars produced per capita mortality rates that rival or even vastly exceed the death tolls of World War I and World War II combined.
I understand the mathematical logic, but I have a really hard time with this, and I imagine anyone listening to this right now feels that exact same discomfort. It raises a profound, agonizing moral dilemma. Is statistical normalization an ethically acceptable way to evaluate human atrocity?
It's a very fair question.
Because when you take the mechanized horror of the Holocaust, or the machetes of the Rwandan genocide, and you reduce them to a microscopic per capita rate on a multi-century line graph, doesn't that fundamentally strip away the moral weight of what happened? It feels like we are losing our humanity in the spreadsheet. If 1 million innocent people are systematically murdered, the tragedy of their destruction isn't somehow lessened just because there happen to be 2 billion other people alive on the other side of the planet who weren't murdered.
That discomfort is not just emotional. It is a central philosophical criticism of the data. Many historians argue exactly what you just articulated. The framework of normalizing mass murder as a per capita rate inherently minimizes the unacceptable nature of the act. It sanitizes the unique industrialized evil of the 20th century. But beyond the profound moral questions, the critics also tear into the actual methodology Pinker uses to build these normalized charts.
Where does the math fall apart?
It falls apart in the margins of error. Pinker's comparisons rely heavily on ancient population estimates. But the data on exactly how many human beings lived on Earth during the Bronze Age collapse or the precise death toll of the Mongol invasions across the Eurasian steppe are incredibly speculative.
We don't have exact census data from 1200 AD.
Exactly. Some historians argue the death tolls for the Anlushan Rebellion are wildly exaggerated by ancient census errors. Building highly confident comparative statements on such notoriously shaky historical foundations is scientifically risky.
That makes sense.
Furthermore, when calculating the 20th century numbers, Pinker relies extensively on data sets compiled by a political scientist named R.J. Rummel. Rummel coined the concept of democide, meaning death by government. But Rummel's methodology has been heavily criticized by modern historians for being wildly inconsistent, prone to double counting, and arguably driven by a specific ideological aim to maximize the death tolls attributed to communist regimes while minimizing others. If the data inputs are flawed, the entire per capita trend line becomes deeply suspect.
So, the math of the 20th century remains a heavily contested battleground. But what if we step away from the grand, overarching trend lines for a moment? Let's look at the actual machinery of human society today. Are there tangible gears in the machine, structural, observable changes in how we govern ourselves that have demonstrably proven to reduce violence? Regardless of whether the long-term graph is perfectly smooth, what are the actual mechanics of peace operating around us right now?
This is where sociology offers much firmer ground. There are 3 well-documented structural mechanisms that actively suppress violence in modern society. The first brings us back to Elias state formation, or what is academically known as the Weberian monopoly on legitimate violence, named after sociologist Max Weber. The data is unambiguous here. Effective, impartial law enforcement drastically reduces interpersonal violence.
We see that correlation constantly. The places in the world today with the highest homicide rates are almost universally places where the state's justice system has either collapsed or become totally corrupted by organized crime. When the police can't or won't protect you, you have to protect yourself, which means arming yourself and engaging in preemptive violence to establish dominance.
Exactly. The functional state acts as a circuit breaker for cycles of retribution.
Okay, so a functional justice system stops me from shooting my neighbor over a property line. But that doesn't explain macro violence. I mean, kings had courts and dungeons, but they still launched massive wars of conquest. What is the mechanism keeping massive industrialized nations from dropping bombs on each other today?
That brings us to the second structural gear, the democratic peace theory. This is arguably one of the most statistically robust findings in the entire field of international relations. The theory observes a simple historical fact. Mature, liberal democracies almost never go to war with one another.
What's the barrier? Is it just that democratic leaders are fundamentally nicer people?
No, it's not about personality. It's about the systemic constraints on power. First, there is democratic transparency. In an autocracy, a dictator can secretly mobilize an army and launch a surprise invasion. In a democracy, mobilizing for war requires public funding, legislative approval, and endless public debate.
You have to get Congress to sign off.
Right. The opposition party and a free press will aggressively scrutinize the decision. It is incredibly difficult to launch a war of aggression when you have to convince a voting public to send their own children to die.
That makes a lot of sense.
Second, democracies tend to be deeply enmeshed in the global commerce networks we discussed earlier. The economic cost of severing supply chains with a fellow democracy is political suicide for an elected leader. And finally, democracies are internally built on the premise of nonviolent conflict resolution. Leaders lose power through elections, not assassinations. They pass laws through debate, not decrees. Those internal cultural norms of negotiation naturally extend outward into how they conduct foreign policy.
Because it's a culture of negotiation.
Yes. And as a direct result of the spread of democratic systems, the period following World War II has seen the absolute lowest rate of interstate warfare in the recorded history of the nation-state.
And what is the third mechanism?
The third is what philosopher Peter Singer termed the expansion of the moral circle. Historically, human empathy was strictly tribal. You cared deeply about your family, your village, your immediate kin group. Everyone outside that tight circle was viewed as less than human, and therefore violence against them carried no moral weight. But over centuries, driven by philosophy, human rights movements, and global communication, that circle of moral concern has progressively expanded outward.
It just keeps getting wider.
It expanded to include other tribes, other nations, other races, women, children, and increasingly even non-human animals.
So what does this all mean for us practically? Let's bring this down to the ground. If you are listening to this right now, as you walk down your street, or as you plan your future without the looming dread of being drafted into a violent border war with a neighboring country tomorrow, that sense of safety isn't an accident of birth. It is the direct result of these invisible institutional mechanics churning away in the background.
Absolutely.
The Weberian state monopoly on force, the interlocking trade of the democratic peace, and the expanding moral circle are the invisible shields protecting your daily existence.
They absolutely are. But recognizing those shields forces us to ask a deeply unsettling philosophical question about that third mechanism, the expanding moral circle. Is this expansion a permanent, irreversible evolution of human morality? Have we actually become a fundamentally more empathetic species? Or is this expanding circle simply a temporary luxury, a psychological byproduct afforded by modern economic prosperity?
Oh, that's a dark thought.
If the global economy crashes, if the food supply chain collapses, if climate pressures create massive resource scarcity, does that moral circle rapidly shrink right back down? Do we instantly revert to only protecting our immediate tribe?
That is terrifying. And it leads us perfectly into the skeptics. Because while those structural mechanics paint a very reassuring picture of our present reality, there are brilliant thinkers who argue that this overarching optimism is not just flawed, it is profoundly dangerous. Let's look at the sharpest critics who completely reject the narrative of a peaceful modern world.
There are two major pillars of critique that dismantle the optimistic view. The first is a philosophical and historical critique spearheaded by thinkers like John Gray. Gray essentially argues that Pinker's better angels thesis is nothing more than Enlightenment ideology masquerading as objective science. He accuses the optimistic view of selectively reading the historical record backwards, cherry-picking data to support a predetermined conclusion that Western liberal democracy is the ultimate pinnacle of human evolution.
And Gray focuses heavily on what he calls structural violence, doesn't he? How does he define that?
Structural violence is the harm inflicted upon people, not by a sword or a bullet, but by the systemic design of social and economic institutions. Gray points out that the grand narrative of declining violence conveniently glosses over the structural violence that the liberal international order was built upon. It ignores the centuries of brutal colonialism and resource extraction that enriched the West. It ignores the systemic violence of extreme poverty, where millions die of preventable diseases due to global economic inequality.
So it's looking at the invisible body count.
Exactly. It ignores the devastation of economic sanctions. To Gray, declaring that we have achieved moral progress because wealthy Western nations aren't currently bombing each other is an insult to the majority of the globe suffering under the structural weight of that very system. Furthermore, Gray warns that whatever physical peace we have achieved is entirely contingent on current economic conditions. It is fragile, and it is entirely reversible.
And then we have Nassim Taleb, who attacks the thesis not from a philosophical angle, but from a purely mathematical and statistical one. Taleb looks at the exact same data sets of war casualties that Pinker uses, but he draws a completely different, much darker conclusion. And it all hinges on how you interpret statistical distribution.
This requires us to really understand the mathematics of risk. Taleb argues that war casualties do not behave like human traits such as height or weight, which follow a normal distribution, often called a bell curve.
Right, like if you measure enough people, most are average height.
Exactly. In a normal distribution, the vast majority of data points cluster around the average. If you sample the height of 1 million people, most will be around 5'7". You might find someone who is 7 feet tall, but you will never ever find someone who is 50 feet tall. The physical mechanics of the system prohibit extreme, catastrophic outliers.
War doesn't work like human height.
Not at all. Taleb demonstrates that war casualties, like wealth distribution or earthquakes, follow what is called a power law distribution. This is a statistical realm defined by fat tails. In a power law environment, catastrophic extreme outlier events are not impossible anomalies. They are mathematically expected, and they account for a disproportionate fraction of the total impact.
Okay, wait. Explain that a bit more.
Well, just as one billionaire possesses more wealth than millions of average citizens combined, a single extreme outlier conflict like World War II can produce more casualties than hundreds of smaller localized wars combined.
The analogy I always use to translate Taleb's math is the Thanksgiving turkey. Imagine a turkey living on a farm. Every single day, the farmer comes out and feeds the turkey. From the turkey's statistical perspective, life is on a flawless upward trajectory. Every day, the data shows that safety, food security, and general well-being are increasing. The turkey is an absolute optimist.
The turkey loves the data.
Right. This goes on for hundreds of days, and the trend line is undeniable, right up until the morning of Thanksgiving. The turkey's historical data was perfectly accurate, but its model of the world was fundamentally wrong because it lacked the mathematical framework to anticipate the catastrophic outlier event that reset its population to zero.
That is exactly it. Taleb is essentially arguing that humanity might just be the turkey. The long peace we've enjoyed since World War II isn't necessarily proof of a permanent evolutionary shift in human nature. It might just be the quiet, peaceful trough between catastrophic, fat-tail outlier events.
This raises an important question for how we govern ourselves moving forward. Both Gray's philosophical critique of structural violence and Taleb's mathematical critique of fat-tail risks have immense, undeniable merit. We know the long-run trend in interpersonal homicide rates has dropped significantly since the Middle Ages. We know the post-WWII pause in major power conflict is a real, observable phenomenon. But whether these realities represent a stable, permanent march toward a utopian future or just contingent, highly fragile conditions that could snap at any moment, that is genuinely uncertain.
And intellectual honesty requires us to stare that uncertainty in the face. We cannot afford the hubris of blindly projecting the current trend of peace indefinitely into the future.
If we can't confidently project the past into the future, we have to look very closely at the present. We have to look at what the geopolitical data from our current decade actually tells us. And when you look at the numbers, it is a deeply mixed picture. It resists any simple categorization as either a perfect continuation of a peaceful trend or a total collapse into chaos.
Let's start with the interpersonal data. The contemporary numbers show us that homicide rates in the vast majority of the developed world, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, reached their lowest recorded historical levels in the 2010s, and they have generally remained incredibly low. The civilizing process appears to be holding firm in these regions.
But there is a huge outlier there.
Yes, there is a glaring, tragic exception to this trend, the United States. The U.S. maintains homicide rates that are substantially fundamentally higher than comparable wealthy democracies. And the data clearly indicates that this disparity is primarily driven by the sheer availability and cultural proliferation of firearms, which simply increase the lethality of interpersonal disputes.
And outside the highly developed world, the picture fractures even further. We see massive localized spikes in violence. Parts of Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa experience extraordinarily high homicide rates. But it's vital to note that these are not traditional wars between standing armies. These fatalities are driven by organized crime, cartel violence, and deep state weakness.
In a grim way, this actually validates Elias's theory, just operating in reverse. Where the state fails to maintain a monopoly on force, where the judicial institutions crumble under corruption, violence instantly rushes back in to fill the vacuum.
It's a total failure of state capacity, which perfectly illustrates how reliant peace is on functional institutions. But where the contemporary data becomes truly alarming for anyone championing the declining violence thesis is the distinct, measurable surge in global armed conflict that began around 2011.
Right. We saw a definite pivot. From 2011 onward, the global numbers for battle-related deaths spiked. We saw the devastating Syrian civil war, the violent fragmentation of states following the Arab Spring, like in Libya and Yemen, the expansion of brutal insurgencies across the Sahel region of Africa, and, of course, the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine.
And I want to be really clear here. Looking at the data since 2011, and we are just looking purely at the geopolitical numbers here, stripping away all the intense politics and taking an entirely neutral statistical view, we see a measurable empirical surge in global armed conflict. We're not taking political sides on these conflicts, but the trend line of a long peace has distinctly ticked upwards.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture we've been discussing, the 2022 invasion of Ukraine is particularly significant to political scientists. It is the largest conventional interstate military conflict on the European continent since 1945. For decades, the mechanisms of the democratic peace, the economic interdependence of the European Union, and the international legal frameworks built after World War II seem to have permanently pacified Europe.
It seemed like war there was impossible.
But the return of a massive land war, complete with trench warfare and artillery barrages, directly tests the resilience of those exact peace mechanisms. It forces every analyst to ask if the post-WWII European peace was a permanent civilizing shift, or simply a 70-year truce before the historical baseline reasserted itself.
To truly grapple with the scale of all this, from prehistoric raids with stone tools to the dizzying complexities of modern geopolitical warfare, we rely heavily on something we haven't even talked about yet: language. The specific vocabulary we use to define harm actually shapes how our civilization perceives and responds to it.
It does. The English vocabulary surrounding violence and conflict is incredibly extensive, highly structured, and deeply culturally situated. We don't just possess a single blunt word for killing. Over centuries, we have developed a linguistic framework where the distinctions we make encode profound legal, moral, and procedural meanings.
Let's unpack those legal and moral distinctions, because they dictate how the state responds. You have the baseline of homicide, which simply means the killing of one human by another. But within that, the intent changes everything. You have murder, which the law defines as the unlawful, intentional, and premeditated taking of a life.
Right, there's planning involved.
But if a fight breaks out in a bar and someone is accidentally killed, that's manslaughter. It's unlawful, but unpremeditated. The physical outcome is identical, a person is dead, but the language dictates a completely different moral judgment and prison sentence.
And as you scale up from interpersonal violence to political violence, the vocabulary becomes even more specific. An assassination isn't just a murder, it is a killing explicitly designed to alter political power. Then we have the term genocide.
Which is actually a relatively new word, right?
Yes, it was coined by the legal scholar Raphael Lemkin in 1944. He combined the Greek word for tribe or race with the Latin word for killing. He realized that humanity lacked a specific word to describe the intentional, systematic destruction of an entire national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And then you have the concept of a war crime, heavily formalized by the Geneva Conventions. A war crime is a specifically prohibited act, like intentionally targeting civilians or torturing prisoners, that occurs within the already violent context of an armed conflict.
We also have this highly structured, almost bureaucratic vocabulary for how we try to stop the violence. It's a ladder of de-escalation. When armies are fighting, the first step is a ceasefire, a temporary, fragile halt to the shooting, usually just to evacuate the wounded.
And if that holds, it might evolve into an armistice, which is a formal military agreement to stop fighting while politicians try to talk.
That might lead to a broader truce. And finally, the ultimate goal, a binding peace treaty that permanently resolves the underlying political dispute. And beyond physical violence, we have recently developed the language of structural violence. Words like systemic racism, oppression, and economic injustice. These terms reflect a modern, broadened definition of violence, recognizing that social systems and laws can inflict devastating harm on populations without ever firing a bullet.
It's a crucial expansion of how we think about harm.
But I have to ask, stepping back from all these definitions, does having a dozen different, highly specific, legally nuanced words for killing actually help humanity reduce violence? Or does it just make us more efficient, more bureaucratic at categorizing the brutality after the fact? I mean, a civilian who is killed in a war crime is just as dead as a soldier killed in lawful combat. Does the vocabulary matter to the victim bleeding out in the rubble?
It absolutely does not matter to the immediate victim in that horrific moment, but it matters immensely to the survival of the civilization as a whole. Precision in language is the absolute bedrock of the entire civilizing process we've been tracking. You cannot enforce international law, you cannot convene tribunals, you cannot prosecute a war crime or prevent a genocide until you have the specific moral and legal vocabulary to separate those acts from the tragic but legally anticipated baseline of traditional armed conflict.
So the words are the tools we use to build the cage around our violence.
Exactly. Language creates the boundaries of acceptable human behavior. You have to name the evil before you can outlaw it. Without the words, you cannot construct the laws. And without the laws, as Elias and Keeley showed us, human societies inevitably revert to the brutal baseline of prehistoric mortality.
Wow. Okay, we have covered an immense, staggering amount of ground today. We started by looking at the crushed skulls of our ancestral hunter-gatherers, facing a 14% mortality rate from constant, environmentally driven warfare. We tracked the incredible plunge in medieval homicide rates, driven by the rise of centralized states, the printing press, and the pacifying incentives of commerce.
It's been a long journey.
It really has. We wrestled with the brutal mathematical paradox of the 20th century, where the sheer volume of death tests our ability to even measure morality. We examined the fragile institutional mechanics of our modern peace and analyzed the precise legal vocabulary we use to try and tame our darkest, most ancient impulses.
It's a lot to process for sure.
And as we wrap up this journey, I want to leave you with a brand new thought to mull over, something that takes everything we've just learned about the history of violence and pushes it into an uncharted future.
I'm intrigued.
If the historical decline of physical violence relied heavily on humans internalizing self-restraint, through the looming presence of centralized states, the physical enforcement of police forces, and the necessity of face-to-face commerce. What happens to human aggression in the digital age?
Oh, that is a huge question.
Right. As we move more and more of our daily interactions, our politics, and our commerce into decentralized, highly anonymous virtual spaces, spaces that completely strip away all physical social regulation, all eye contact, and the immediate threat of state force, what happens to our psychology? Will our innate hostility remain safely trapped behind screens, acting as a harmless release valve for our primate brains? Or will that unchecked, unpoliced, algorithmically amplified virtual aggression eventually bleed back out into the physical world, dismantling the civilizing process we spent thousands of years building? Thank you so much for joining us in this deep dive. Stay curious, keep questioning the narrative, and we'll see you next time.
Enjoyed the episode? Then subscribe for more conversations, more English, and more Fluent Daily. And don't forget to share with a friend.